On the morning of April 3, 1987, a public library clerk in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, placed a routine phone call to an address on Oakwood Drive regarding a book that had been checked out in October 1979 and never returned. The book was a biography of Leon Trotsky, catalogued under call number 947.084092, and according to the library's records, it was now 2,742 days overdue. The clerk's name was Janet Paulson. She was 51 years old, had worked at the Cedar Rapids Public Library for 14 years, and handled overdue notifications with a methodical efficiency that left no account unsettled. The address associated with the unreturned book belonged to a man named Martin Vasek, who, according to the library's patron database, had moved to Cedar Rapids in September 1979 and registered for a library card 3 weeks later. He had checked out 6 books during his first visit. 5 had been returned within the standard 3-week lending period. 1 had not. Janet made the call from her desk on the second floor of the library, a cramped workspace surrounded by filing cabinets and stacks of index cards that the library had not yet migrated to the new computerized system being installed in phases throughout 1986 and 1987. The phone rang 4 times before a man answered. His voice was calm, slightly accented in a way that Janet couldn't quite place, and when she explained the reason for her call, he paused for what seemed like longer than necessary before responding. He apologized for the oversight, said he had completely forgotten about the book, and asked whether he could simply pay the fine and keep it since he'd clearly gotten his money's worth from it over the past 8 years. Janet told him that was not how the library handled long-term overdue materials, that the book needed to be either returned or replaced, and that the accumulated fine at 10 cents per day was now $274.20, though the library would be willing to cap the fine at $50 if the book was returned within 2 weeks. The man agreed, said he would bring the book in that week, and thanked her for the call. Janet noted the conversation in the patron's file and moved on to the next overdue account on her list. But 2 weeks passed and the book did not arrive. Janet placed a second call on April 20th. This time, there was no answer. She left a message on an answering machine, repeating the same information about the overdue book and the capped fine, and she noted in the file that a second attempt had been made. Another week passed. Still nothing. On April 29th, Janet escalated the matter to her supervisor, a woman named Dorothy Chen, who had the authority to initiate collection procedures for accounts that had remained unresolved after multiple contact attempts. Dorothy reviewed the file, saw that the patron owed $50 and had been unresponsive for nearly a month, and authorized Janet to send a formal collection notice by certified mail. The notice was mailed on May 1, 1987. It stated that Martin Vasek had 30 days to return the book and pay the capped fine of $50, or the library would refer the account to the Johnson County Small Claims Court for recovery. This was standard procedure for accounts over $25 that had remained unpaid after 60 days of notification attempts. The certified letter was signed for on May 4th at the Oakwood Drive address, according to Postal Service records. But no response came. No book was returned. No payment was made. On June 8th, Dorothy filed the paperwork with the Johnson County Clerk of Courts, initiating a small claims case against Martin Vasek for the return of library property, valued at $18.95 plus fines totaling $50. A court summons was issued and mailed to the Oakwood Drive address on June 12th, requiring Vasek to appear in small claims court on July 22, 1987, at 2:00 in the afternoon to respond to the library's claim. The summons was returned to the court on June 24th with a notation from the postal carrier that the address was vacant and that mail delivery had been discontinued at the location effective June 10th. Dorothy contacted the Johnson County Sheriff's Office to determine whether a forwarding address had been filed. None had. She contacted the Cedar Rapids utility companies to see if service had been transferred to a new location under Vasek's name. It had not. Electricity and gas service to the Oakwood Drive property had been terminated on June 9th with no forwarding information provided. Martin Vasek had disappeared. Under normal circumstances, this would have been the end of it. Libraries lost books all the time. People moved without paying fines. The cost of pursuing the matter further exceeded the value of what could realistically be recovered. But Dorothy Chen was not someone who let things go easily. She had worked in public libraries for 23 years, and she believed strongly in the principle that public resources needed to be protected, even when the amounts involved were small. She contacted the landlord of the Oakwood Drive property, a man named Gerald Richter who owned several rental houses in the area, and she asked whether Vasek had left a forwarding address or provided any information about where he was moving. Richter told her that Vasek had paid rent on time for nearly 8 years without a single late payment or complaint, but that in early June he had given notice that he was relocating for work and would be vacating the property by June 10th. He had paid his final month's rent, returned the keys, and left the house in excellent condition. Richter had no forwarding address and no contact information beyond the phone number that was now disconnected. Dorothy thanked him and made a note in the file. Then she did something that would seem unremarkable at the time, but would prove to be the thread that unraveled an intelligence operation that had been running successfully in the American Midwest for nearly a decade. She called the Cedar Rapids Police Department and filed a report about the missing book. The officer who took the report, a patrol officer named Dennis Kowalski, listened politely as Dorothy explained the situation. He noted the details, the overdue book, the unpaid fine, the sudden disappearance of the patron, and he told Dorothy he would add the information to the department's records. But he also told her honestly that unless there was evidence of criminal intent or theft, there was not much the police could do about someone skipping town with a library book. Dorothy understood that. But she asked Kowalski if he could at least check whether Martin Vasek had any prior interactions with law enforcement in Cedar Rapids, any arrests or incidents that might provide additional information about him. Kowalski agreed and ran Vasek's name through the department's record system. What came back was unremarkable. Martin Vasek had no criminal record in Cedar Rapids, no arrests, no traffic citations, no complaints, no incidents. He appeared to be exactly what his rental history suggested. A quiet, reliable tenant who had lived in the area for 8 years and then moved on. But there was one notation in the system that caught Kowalski's attention. In March 1985, a patrol officer had responded to a noise complaint at the Oakwood Drive address. Neighbors had reported hearing loud voices and what sounded like an argument coming from Vasek's house late at night. The responding officer had knocked on the door, spoken briefly with Vasek, and determined that the noise was from a television that had been turned up too loud. No citation had been issued. The officer had noted in the report that Vasek had been polite and cooperative, and that the matter had been resolved without further action. It was a nothing incident, the kind of call that patrol officers responded to dozens of times a week. But what caught Kowalski's eye was a detail the responding officer had included in the report, a detail that was not standard practice, but that some officers included as a matter of habit when documenting interactions with residents. The officer had noted that Vasek spoke with a foreign accent, possibly Eastern European, and that when asked for identification, Vasek had provided an Iowa driver's license that showed a birth date of August 14, 1941, making him 43 years old at the time of the incident. Kowalski made a note of this and passed the information back to Dorothy, along with his assessment that there was nothing criminal about the situation, but that if she wanted to pursue it further, she might consider reaching out to the FBI field office in Des Moines to see if they had any interest in a foreign national who had suddenly disappeared after 8 years of stable residence. Dorothy thought the suggestion was unusual, possibly even excessive for a situation involving a missing library book. But something about the entire sequence bothered her. The fact that Vasek had lived in Cedar Rapids for 8 years without incident, paid his rent on time, maintained a clean record, and then vanished within days of receiving a court summons. The fact that he had checked out a biography of Leon Trotsky in 1979 and kept it for 8 years without ever attempting to return it or respond to overdue notices until the library escalated the matter to legal action. It felt deliberate, calculated, as if the summons had triggered a response that went far beyond what a normal person would do over a $50 fine. On June 30th, 1987, Dorothy called the FBI field office in Des Moines and asked to speak to someone about a missing person case that might involve a foreign national. She was transferred to an agent named Michael Brennan, who listened to her explanation with what sounded like polite but minimal interest. Dorothy described the overdue book, the court summons, the sudden disappearance, and the detail about Vasek's Eastern European accent. Brennan asked a few clarifying questions, took down the basic information, and told Dorothy he would look into it and get back to her if the FBI determined there was anything worth investigating. Dorothy hung up the phone, assuming that would be the end of it, that the FBI had more important things to do than track down a man who owed the Cedar Rapids Public Library $50. But she had done what she could, and she documented the call in the library's file and closed the case. What Dorothy did not know was that Michael Brennan did not dismiss her call. Instead, he spent the next 3 days running Martin Vasek's name through every database the FBI had access to, cross-referencing it with immigration records, Social Security Administration files, state driver's license databases, credit reports, employment histories, and any other documentation that might provide a clearer picture of who Martin Vasek was and why he had disappeared. What Brennan found was a profile that was simultaneously unremarkable and deeply suspicious. Martin Vasek had entered the United States in August 1979, according to immigration records on file with the former Immigration and Naturalization Service. He had arrived on a flight from Vienna, Austria, carrying a valid Czechoslovak passport issued in Prague in June 1979. His visa application listed his occupation as technical translator and stated that he intended to reside in the United States for an indefinite period while seeking employment in his field. His entry had been processed without incident, and he had been granted a standard work visa that was renewed in 1982 and again in 1985 without any flags or issues. Once in the United States, Vasek had moved to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where, according to Social Security records, he had been employed since October 1979 by a small company called Midwestern Technical Documentation Services, a firm that provided translation and technical writing services for manufacturing companies in the region. His employment had been continuous until June 1987, when it abruptly ended with no termination paperwork filed and no forwarding information provided to the employer. He had filed federal tax returns every year from 1979 through 1986, reporting modest income consistent with his stated employment and claiming no dependents. He had maintained a checking account at a local Cedar Rapids bank since October 1979, making regular deposits and withdrawals that showed a stable financial pattern with no unusual transactions or large cash movements. He had registered a vehicle with the Iowa Department of Transportation in 1980, a used Ford sedan that he had purchased from a local dealership, and he had maintained valid auto insurance without any claims or lapses in coverage. On paper, Martin Vasek was exactly what he appeared to be, a Czech immigrant working a low-profile job in the American Midwest, living quietly, paying his bills, and staying out of trouble. But there were details that did not quite fit. Brennan noted that Vasek's employment history prior to arriving in the United States was vague. The visa application listed previous employment as a translator in Prague, but provided no specific employer names or contact information. Brennan cross-referenced Vasek's name with records of Czechoslovak defectors and emigrants who had left the country during the late 1970s, a period when the Czechoslovak government was still under strict Soviet control and emigration was tightly regulated. He found no record of Martin Vasek applying for asylum or refugee status. He found no indication that Vasek had been part of any dissident movements or had any political reasons for leaving Czechoslovakia. He had simply arrived in the United States with a valid passport and a work visa, and had settled into a quiet life in Iowa. The other detail that struck Brennan as odd was the timing of Vasek's disappearance. June 1987 was not a period of heightened tension or major geopolitical shifts that would have prompted a recall or extraction of intelligence assets. The Reagan administration was in its final 18 months. U.S.-Soviet relations were warming under Gorbachev's reforms. There was no obvious external trigger that would explain why someone who had been living successfully undercover for 8 years would suddenly vanish. Unless the trigger was internal. Unless something had happened that compromised Vasek's cover and forced him to leave before he could be identified and arrested. Brennan picked up the phone and called the FBI's Counterintelligence Division at headquarters in Washington. He spoke to a senior analyst named Catherine Reeves, who specialized in tracking Soviet bloc intelligence activities in the United States. He explained the situation, the overdue library book, the court summons, the sudden disappearance, the Eastern European accent, the vague employment history. Reeves listened carefully, and then asked Brennan to send her everything he had on Martin Vasek, including copies of his visa application, employment records, tax filings, and any other documentation he had been able to gather. She told him she would run the information through counterintelligence databases and see if anything matched known or suspected intelligence operatives. 3 days later, on July 7, 1987, Reeves called Brennan back. What she told him confirmed what Brennan had begun to suspect. Martin Vasek did not exist. At least not in the way his documentation suggested. The name Martin Vasek appeared in Czechoslovak records as a real person born in Prague on August 14, 1941. But that Martin Vasek had died in a car accident outside Prague in February 1978. His death certificate was on file with Czechoslovak authorities and had been properly recorded. Someone had taken the identity of a dead man, obtained a passport in that name, and used it to enter the United States in 1979. The person living in Cedar Rapids for the past 8 years was not Martin Vasek. He was someone else entirely. And whoever he was, he had been living under deep cover in the American heartland for nearly a decade before a $50 library fine and a court summons had forced him to run. The first person who knew something was wrong was Gerald Richter, the landlord who had rented the Oakwood Drive house to Martin Vasek for nearly 8 years. 3 weeks after Vasek's sudden departure in June 1987, Richter received a call from a man who identified himself as Special Agent Michael Brennan with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Brennan asked whether he could meet with Richter to discuss a former tenant, and Richter, confused but cooperative, agreed to meet at a coffee shop in downtown Cedar Rapids on July 10th. Brennan arrived precisely on time, wearing a conservative suit and carrying a leather briefcase. He showed Richter his credentials, ordered black coffee, and asked him to describe everything he knew about Martin Vasek. Richter explained that Vasek had been an ideal tenant, paid on time for 8 years, never caused problems, left the property in excellent condition, and gave proper notice before vacating. Brennan asked whether Vasek had mentioned where he was moving or why. Richter said only that Vasek had told him he was relocating for work and had not provided additional details. Brennan asked whether Richter had ever noticed anything unusual about Vasek's behavior, whether he had frequent visitors, whether he received unusual mail, whether he ever displayed signs of financial difficulty. Richter thought carefully and said that Vasek had been remarkably consistent in his habits, that he received very little mail, mostly bills and occasional catalogs, that he rarely had visitors, and that he had never complained about money. Brennan thanked him, left a card with a phone number, and asked him to call if he remembered anything else. Richter left the meeting deeply uneasy. The FBI investigation that had begun with a library clerk's phone call about an overdue book now escalated into a full-scale counterintelligence operation. Brennan returned to Des Moines and assembled a task force that included agents from the Des Moines and Omaha field offices, analysts from the FBI's counterintelligence division at headquarters in Washington, and liaison officers from the CIA who specialized in Soviet bloc intelligence operations. The task force was given a classified designation, Operation Cedar Trail, and its mandate was to determine who Martin Vasek really was, what he had been doing in Iowa for 8 years, and whether he had left behind any indication of where he had gone or what intelligence he had gathered. The first priority was establishing Vasek's true identity. Catherine Reeves, the senior counterintelligence analyst who had identified the stolen identity, worked with the FBI's legal attaché office in Prague to obtain additional information about the real Martin Vasek, who had died in 1978. The Czech authorities, still under communist control in 1987 but beginning to show signs of the reforms that would sweep Eastern Europe within 2 years, were initially uncooperative. But through back channels and intelligence liaison relationships that operated even during the Cold War when mutual interest aligned, American officials were able to confirm that the real Martin Vasek's passport had been reported stolen in June 1978. Approximately 4 months after his death. The theft had never been investigated seriously. Passport theft was common in Czechoslovakia, and authorities assumed it had been taken for use in black market transactions or minor fraud. No one had imagined it would be used to create a legend for a deep-cover intelligence officer entering the United States. With this information, Reeves worked backward through immigration records, cross-referencing the entry date of August 1979 with flight manifests and visa applications. She found that the man using Martin Vasek's identity had arrived on Pan Am Flight 107 from Vienna to New York's Kennedy Airport on August 21, 1979, at 6:47 in the evening. His entry had been processed without incident by an immigration officer who later had no memory of the individual, but whose stamp appeared on the passport documentation. From New York, Vasek had taken a Greyhound bus to Cedar Rapids, a journey that would have taken approximately 24 hours with multiple stops, arriving in Iowa on August 23rd. This fit the timeline of his library card registration in September and his employment beginning in October. But who was he really? The FBI assembled a profile based on what they knew. He was likely Czechoslovak or possibly Soviet, given the passport origin and the resources required to create such a detailed legend. He was technically educated, given his employment as a technical translator and the sophistication of his cover. He was middle-aged, probably in his early to mid-40s in 1979, which would make him late 40s when he disappeared in 1987. He had received extensive training in tradecraft and deep cover operations, given the quality of his documentation and the discipline he had maintained for 8 years. And he was important enough to Soviet or Czechoslovak intelligence that they had invested years in building his legend and positioning him in the American Midwest. But important for what purpose? This was the question that consumed the investigation through the summer and fall of 1987. Cedar Rapids was not a major intelligence target. It was not near military installations. It was not a center of defense research or classified government work. It was an agricultural and light manufacturing hub in the heartland, economically stable but strategically unremarkable. The FBI began investigating Midwest Technical Documentation Services, the company where Vasek had been employed since October 1979. The company occupied a small office suite in a commercial building near Interstate 380 and employed 11 people who provided translation services, technical writing, and documentation support for manufacturing companies throughout Iowa and neighboring states. The owner, a man named Robert Delaney, told FBI agents that Vasek had been an excellent employee, reliable, skilled in Czech, Russian, and German, with a strong understanding of technical terminology related to engineering and manufacturing. Delaney said that Vasek had worked on projects for approximately 24 different client companies over 8 years, translating technical manuals, specifications, and correspondence. When Brennan asked for a list of those client companies, Delaney provided it without hesitation. The FBI spent the next 3 weeks investigating every company on that list. What they discovered was deeply troubling. Of the 24 companies Vasek had worked for, 16 were involved in some aspect of defense contracting or produced components that had potential military applications. These were not major defense contractors like Lockheed or Boeing. They were small to mid-sized manufacturers producing precision components, hydraulic systems, electronic controls, specialized alloys, and other parts that fed into larger defense supply chains. Individually, none of these companies handled highly classified information. But collectively, the technical documents Vasek had been translating and handling gave him access to detailed information about American manufacturing capabilities, material specifications, production processes, and supply chain networks that would be extremely valuable to Soviet military intelligence trying to assess American industrial capacity. He had been positioned perfectly, working for a small, innocuous company that gave him legitimate access to technical information from multiple defense-related manufacturers without ever triggering security reviews, because he was not directly employed by those manufacturers and never requested access to classified materials. The FBI's damage assessment team began the painstaking process of reconstructing what information Vasek might have had access to during his 8 years in Cedar Rapids. They reviewed every project he had worked on, every document he had translated, every client facility he had visited. The assessment, completed in November 1987 and classified top secret, concluded that Vasek had potentially obtained detailed technical information on precision machining techniques, alloy composition specifications, hydraulic system designs, quality control processes, and production capacity data for more than a dozen companies involved in defense manufacturing. None of this information was classified in the traditional sense. It was proprietary business information that companies assumed was protected simply by not being widely distributed. But in the aggregate, it provided exactly the kind of industrial intelligence that Soviet military planners needed to assess American manufacturing capabilities and identify potential vulnerabilities in defense supply chains. The assessment noted that Vasek had never been observed attempting to photograph documents, remove materials from client facilities, or engage in obvious espionage activities. But he had not needed to. His job gave him legitimate access to technical documents that he could review, analyze, and memorize. And with the training of a professional intelligence officer, he could have retained detailed information and transmitted it through methods that left no physical evidence. The FBI concluded that Martin Vasek, whoever he really was, had been running a near-perfect deep cover operation for 8 years. He had gathered valuable intelligence without ever breaking the law in ways that could be detected, without ever arousing suspicion, and without ever needing to take risks that might expose him. He had simply done his job exceptionally well, and in doing so had served his true employers in Moscow or Prague. But what had prompted him to run? This question led the FBI back to the sequence of events in June 1987. The library's collection notice had been sent by certified mail on May 1st and signed for on May 4th. The court summons had been mailed on June 12th and returned as undeliverable on June 24th, with notation that the address was vacant as of June 10th. Vasek had terminated his utilities on June 9th, given notice to his landlord in early June, and vacated the property by June 10th. This meant he had made the decision to disappear sometime between receiving the court summons and June 10th, a window of approximately 5 to 8 days. The timing suggested that the summons itself had been the trigger. But why would a court summons over a library fine cause a trained intelligence officer to abandon an 8-year operation? FBI analysts developed several theories. The most likely was that Vasek had recognized that a court appearance would subject him to scrutiny that might expose inconsistencies in his cover identity. Court records were public. His name would be entered into official databases. If questioned in court, he might be required to provide additional identification or answer questions about his background under oath. For someone living under a stolen identity, even a minor legal proceeding represented unacceptable risk. The second theory was that Moscow or Prague had been monitoring for any signs that Vasek's cover was compromised, and that the appearance of legal documentation with his name might have triggered an extraction protocol. Soviet intelligence services maintained elaborate systems for monitoring their deep cover officers, watching for indicators that they had been identified or were under investigation. A sudden legal action, even something as trivial as a library fine, could have been interpreted as a probe designed to force Vasek into a situation where his identity would be verified. The third theory, which emerged from conversations with CIA analysts who specialized in Soviet intelligence operations, was that Vasek might have been scheduled for extraction anyway, and that the court summons had simply accelerated an already planned departure. Deep cover officers typically operated for 5 to 10 years before being rotated out to prevent burnout, to limit exposure, and to allow them to return to their home countries before their cover identities became too difficult to maintain. By June 1987, Vasek had been in place for nearly 8 years, approaching the upper end of typical deployment lengths. The summons might have simply forced him to leave a few months earlier than originally planned. Regardless of the specific reason, the FBI concluded that Vasek had executed a well-prepared exfiltration. He had left no forwarding address, closed all accounts, severed all ties, and disappeared completely within a matter of days. This level of efficiency suggested he had maintained an emergency escape plan throughout his time in Cedar Rapids, ready to activate on short notice. The question was where he had gone. The FBI investigated this with every resource available. They checked border crossing records, looking for anyone matching Vasek's description departing through Canada or Mexico in June 1987. They reviewed airline passenger manifests for flights to Eastern Europe or routes that might connect to Soviet bloc countries. They monitored known Soviet intelligence networks, looking for any indication that an officer had been extracted from the United States. They found nothing. Vasek had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. Catherine Reeves, working from her office at FBI headquarters in Washington, developed a hypothesis about Vasek's likely escape route based on patterns observed in other deep cover exfiltrations. She believed he had probably driven north from Iowa toward the Canadian border, possibly entering through a remote crossing point in North Dakota or Minnesota, where border security was less intensive than at major checkpoints. Once in Canada, he would have made his way to a major city, probably Toronto or Montreal, where Soviet intelligence maintained established networks and could provide support for extracted officers. From there, he would have been moved through a series of safe houses and eventually transported to Europe via commercial flight, under yet another false identity, possibly traveling through a neutral country like Austria or Finland, before continuing to Moscow or Prague. This route would have minimized risk and left minimal documentation. But without physical evidence or confirmed sightings, it remained speculation. What was not speculation was the fact that the FBI had lost him. By the time the investigation reached full intensity in late summer 1987, Vasek had been gone for more than 2 months and was almost certainly beyond American jurisdiction. The failure to locate him was frustrating but not surprising. Deep cover officers who successfully executed extractions rarely left traces that could be followed. The best the FBI could do was document what they had learned, identify the intelligence that had been compromised, and implement measures to prevent similar operations in the future. But there was one aspect of the case that troubled Michael Brennan more than the operational failure. It was the human element, the question of who Martin Vasek had been beneath the cover identity. Brennan had spent months investigating this man, reviewing his employment records, interviewing people who had known him, examining the house he had lived in, the library books he had checked out, the groceries he had purchased. And what emerged from all this investigation was a portrait of profound isolation and loneliness. Vasek had no close friends. His relationships were pleasant but superficial. He had no romantic attachments. He maintained no hobbies that involved other people. He went to work, came home, occasionally went to dinner or a movie alone, and otherwise existed in a state of careful solitude. Neighbors described him as polite but distant. Co-workers said he was professional but never socialized outside work. His landlord remembered him as quiet and reliable, but could not recall a single meaningful conversation in 8 years. The man had lived in Cedar Rapids for nearly a decade and had left behind almost no impression on anyone. Brennan, who had spent 20 years in law enforcement and counterintelligence, found this deeply sad. Whatever Vasek's real name was, whatever ideology had motivated him to serve Soviet intelligence, whatever training had prepared him for deep cover work, he had spent 8 years living a life of complete emotional emptiness. No genuine connections, no real friendships, no authentic relationships. Everything had been performance. Every conversation calculated, every interaction designed to maintain cover rather than express actual human connection. It was, Brennan thought, a kind of prison sentence self-imposed in service of a cause that probably did not care about him as an individual. In December 1987, the FBI officially closed the active phase of Operation Cedar Trail. A final classified report was submitted to the Department of Justice, the CIA, and the National Security Council summarizing what had been learned and what intelligence had been compromised. Recommendations were made for enhanced security reviews of translation services and technical documentation companies that worked with defense contractors. Alerts were distributed to law enforcement agencies across the Midwest, warning that foreign intelligence services were using small, seemingly innocuous businesses to gather industrial intelligence. And Martin Vasek's name was added to databases of known or suspected foreign intelligence officers, flagged for arrest if he ever attempted to re-enter the United States. But the story did not end there. In March 1990, nearly 3 years after Vasek's disappearance, and 6 months after the fall of the Berlin Wall, a journalist named David Hoffman, who covered intelligence matters for the Washington Post, received an anonymous letter postmarked from Vienna. The letter contained a single page of typed text and a photograph. The text described a deep-cover Czechoslovak intelligence officer who had operated in the American Midwest during the 1980s under the name Martin Vasek, and who had been extracted in June 1987 after his cover was threatened by a routine legal action. The text provided specific details about Vasek's work, his employer, the client companies he had gathered intelligence from, and the timeline of his extraction. The photograph showed a middle-aged man with receding hair and wire-rimmed glasses standing in what appeared to be a European city square. On the back of the photograph was written in English, Prague, November 1989. Hoffman, who had extensive contacts within the intelligence community, brought the letter and photograph to the FBI's attention. Brennan was brought in to review the materials, and he confirmed that the operational details described in the letter were accurate and had never been publicly disclosed. This meant the letter had been written by someone with inside knowledge of the case, either someone from American intelligence who had worked on the investigation, or someone from Czechoslovak or Soviet intelligence who had direct knowledge of Vasek's operation. The timing of the letter was significant. March 1990 was a period of rapid political change in Eastern Europe. The Berlin Wall had fallen in November 1989. Communist governments across the region were collapsing or transitioning to democracy. Czechoslovakia had undergone its Velvet Revolution in November and December 1989, peacefully replacing communist rule with a democratic government led by dissident playwright Václav Havel. In this context of upheaval and transition, intelligence officers from former communist services were making decisions about their futures, and some were attempting to establish relationships with Western services or journalists as insurance against uncertain times. Brennan believed the letter had been sent by someone within Czechoslovak intelligence, possibly someone who had handled Vasek during his time in Iowa, and who was now, with the communist system collapsing, attempting to demonstrate their value to Western intelligence by providing information about successful operations. The photograph suggested that Vasek had indeed returned to Prague after his extraction, and had been there as recently as November 1989, when the Velvet Revolution was taking place. But who had taken the photograph and why they had chosen to send it to an American journalist remained unclear. Hoffman wrote a story about the case that was published in the Washington Post in April 1990, under the headline, "Soviet Spy Operated Undetected in Iowa for 8 Years, FBI Says." The story described the basic facts of Vasek's operation, his work as a technical translator, his sudden disappearance after receiving a court summons over an overdue library book, and the FBI's conclusion that he had been gathering industrial intelligence on American defense manufacturing capabilities. The story did not include the photograph or specific details about the investigation that remained classified, but it brought the case into public awareness and generated significant media attention. For Janet Paulson, the library clerk who had made the original phone call about the overdue book, the revelation that her routine collection effort had uncovered a Soviet intelligence operation was surreal and somewhat overwhelming. She was interviewed by local media, appeared briefly on regional television news, and found herself described as the woman who exposed a spy by enforcing library policies. She handled the attention with characteristic modesty, saying she had simply been doing her job and had no idea the situation would lead to anything significant. Dorothy Chen, the supervisor who had escalated the matter to the Cedar Rapids Police Department and later to the FBI, was similarly modest in interviews, though she admitted feeling validated that her instinct to pursue the case had been correct. The story generated debate within library and law enforcement communities about the importance of following procedures even in seemingly trivial matters, and about how ordinary institutional processes could sometimes intersect with national security in unexpected ways. For the FBI, the case became a teaching example used in counterintelligence training. New agents were told the story of Martin Vasek as illustration of how deep cover officers operated, how they embedded themselves in ordinary communities, how they exploited legitimate employment for intelligence gathering, and how even small anomalies like an unreturned library book could be the thread that unraveled an operation. The Cedar Rapids Public Library, meanwhile, faced a decision about what to do with the overdue book that had started everything. The biography of Leon Trotsky, catalogued under call number 947.084.092, had never been returned. It remained listed in the library's records as missing, checked out to Martin Vasek in October 1979, now more than a decade overdue. Dorothy Chen proposed that the library should close the account, write off the book as lost, and move on. But the library director, a woman named Margaret Foster, who had a sense of history and institutional memory, suggested something different. She proposed that they keep the record open indefinitely, that the book remain permanently listed as checked out to Martin Vasek, as a reminder of the unusual role the library had played in a counterintelligence investigation. The library board agreed, and as of today, more than 3 decades later, the Cedar Rapids Public Library's catalog still shows that biography of Leon Trotsky as checked out to Martin Vasek with a due date of November 10, 1979, and accumulated fines of an amount that the system no longer bothers to calculate. It exists as a permanent anomaly in the database, a footnote to a Cold War operation that unfolded in the most ordinary of American settings. As for Martin Vasek himself, his fate after returning to Czechoslovakia remains unclear. The FBI and CIA made efforts through the 1990s to identify his real name and determine what had become of him, working with newly cooperative Czech intelligence services who were willing to provide information about former communist operations in exchange for assistance and good relations with the West. Some information was obtained. American officials learned that Vasek had indeed been a Czechoslovak intelligence officer, not Soviet, though he had been working in coordination with the KGB as was standard for Warsaw Pact intelligence services during the Cold War. They learned that his operation in Iowa had been considered highly successful by Czech intelligence, and that the industrial information he had provided had been shared with Soviet military planners and had contributed to assessments of American defense manufacturing capabilities. They learned that he had been extracted successfully in June 1987 and had returned to Prague, where he had been reassigned to training duties, passing on his tradecraft and experience to younger officers. But his real name was never officially confirmed by Czech authorities, who maintained that certain operational details remained classified even after the transition to democracy. The photograph, sent to the Washington Post in 1990, was never authenticated, and the person who sent it never came forward. In 2003, a former Czech intelligence officer named Karel Novotný published a memoir in Prague that included a chapter about deep cover operations in the United States during the 1980s. Novotný, who had worked in the Czech Foreign Intelligence Service during that period, described an officer he referred to only as Agent M, who had operated in the American Midwest gathering technical intelligence, and who had been extracted after his cover was threatened by an unexpected legal complication. The details of Agent M's operation matched what was known about Martin Vasek. Novotný wrote that Agent M had returned to Czechoslovakia in 1987 and had continued working in intelligence training and analysis until 1991, when the Czech Foreign Intelligence Service was reorganized following the collapse of communism. At that point, Novotný wrote, Agent M had retired with a modest pension and had reportedly moved to a small town in southern Bohemia where he lived quietly, declining interviews and refusing to discuss his career. Novotny's memoir suggested that Agent M had struggled with the transition from active operations to civilian life, that years of living under deep cover had made it difficult for him to form genuine relationships or trust people even after returning home. The book described him as profoundly isolated, a man who had given his most productive years to intelligence work and had been left with nothing but memories of a life that had never been real. Whether this description referred to the man who had lived as Martin Vasek in Cedar Rapids is impossible to confirm. Novotny died in 2007 and never revealed Agent M's true identity. Czech intelligence officials have neither confirmed nor denied that the account refers to a real person. But if it is true, it suggests an ending that is both sad and appropriate for a man who spent 8 years pretending to be someone else. The human cost of the Vasek operation extended beyond the officer himself. The FBI's investigation in 1987 had identified 16 companies that Vasek had worked with and had access to their technical information. Each of these companies was notified that their proprietary data might have been compromised and that they should review their security procedures. For several small manufacturers already struggling with competition and market pressures, the revelation that their technical specifications and production processes might have been passed to Soviet intelligence was devastating. At least 2 companies faced difficulties securing future defense contracts because of concerns about their security practices. One company, a precision machining firm in Waterloo that had employed Vasek's translation services for equipment manuals, went out of business in 1989 after losing several major contracts. The owner, a man named Thomas Eckhart, told local media that the association with the espionage case had created a stigma that customers and contractors could not overlook. Whether the Vasek connection was the primary cause of the company's failure or simply contributed to existing problems is unclear, but Eckhart believed it had been a significant factor, and he expressed bitterness that a routine business decision to hire a translator had resulted in his company being linked to Soviet espionage. There were also personal costs for individuals who had known Vasek. Colleagues at Midwest Technical Documentation Services were interviewed multiple times by FBI agents, asked detailed questions about Vasek's behavior, his conversations, his work habits. Several expressed feelings of betrayal and foolishness, saying they had worked alongside this man for years, had chatted with him over coffee, had considered him a competent colleague, and had never suspected anything unusual. Robert Delaney, the owner of the company, said in a 1990 interview that he felt personally responsible for having employed someone who turned out to be a foreign intelligence officer, and that the experience had made him deeply cautious about trusting anyone. Gerald Richter, the landlord, said he had replayed every interaction with Vasek in his mind, trying to identify signs he should have noticed, and had concluded that either Vasek had been extraordinarily skilled at deception, or that Richter himself had been extraordinarily naive. Either way, he said, the experience had changed how he viewed people, and had made him more suspicious in ways he did not like. These were the ordinary Americans who had been touched by Vasek's operation, people who had interacted with him in routine contexts, and who afterward had to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the reality of who he actually was. For most, this was a disorienting and unpleasant experience that left them feeling manipulated and uncertain about their own judgment. The broader legacy of the Martin Vasek case is complex. Within the intelligence community, it is remembered as an example of how effectively foreign intelligence services could operate in the American heartland during the Cold War, and how small businesses and routine commercial relationships could be exploited for intelligence gathering without ever triggering traditional security measures. It led to changes in how the FBI and other agencies approached counterintelligence in non-traditional settings, with increased attention paid to companies that provided services to defense contractors, even if those companies themselves did not handle classified information. For the general public, the case when it became known through media coverage in 1990 served as a reminder that Cold War espionage was not limited to Washington, New York, or other major cities, that intelligence operations could unfold in places like Cedar Rapids where people assumed such things did not happen. This realization was both fascinating and unsettling, confirming that the invisible war between superpowers touched even the most ordinary communities. For historians and researchers studying Cold War intelligence operations, the Vasek case is significant because it illustrates the sophistication and patience of deep cover operations. Vasek spent 8 years in Cedar Rapids, maintaining his cover, gathering intelligence incrementally, never taking unnecessary risks, and only leaving when external circumstances forced his hand. This level of discipline and long-term commitment represents tradecraft of the highest order, and suggests that Soviet and Czech intelligence services were willing to invest enormous resources in operations that might not yield immediate results, but that built comprehensive intelligence pictures over time. The case also raises questions about what might have been missed. If Martin Vasek operated successfully in Iowa for 8 years and was only identified after he had already escaped, how many other deep cover officers might have operated in similar contexts without ever being detected? How many are still operating today under different circumstances and with different targets? These are questions that counterintelligence professionals continue to grapple with, knowing that the nature of deep cover work is that success is measured precisely by remaining invisible. In November 2019, the FBI's Omaha field office organized a small event commemorating the 40th anniversary of Vasek's arrival in the United States. The event was not publicized and was attended primarily by retired agents who had worked on Operation Cedar Trail, along with a few current counterintelligence officials. Michael Brennan, by then 76 years old and long retired from the Bureau, was invited to speak. He told the assembled group that the Vasek case had been one of the most interesting investigations of his career, precisely because it had been so ordinary on the surface. He said that espionage in the real world was rarely dramatic, that it usually involved patient, methodical work by professionals on both sides, and that the Vasek case exemplified this reality. He also said that he occasionally thought about the man he had spent months investigating, wondering whether Vasek ever regretted the choices he had made, whether he ever missed the quiet life he had built in Iowa even though it had been a fiction, whether he had ever formed any genuine attachment to the place or the people despite his training and his mission. Brennan said he suspected the answer was that Vasek probably felt nothing about Cedar Rapids, except perhaps relief that he had escaped before being arrested, that intelligence officers were trained to suppress personal feelings, and that successful ones did not allow themselves to become emotionally attached to their cover identities. But Brennan also said he liked to imagine, perhaps sentimentally, that somewhere in a small town in the Czech Republic, an old man sometimes thought about Iowa, about the house on Oakwood Drive, about the library book he never returned, and felt something that might have been regret or nostalgia or simply the quiet ache of a life that had been simultaneously real and completely artificial. The truth, of course, is that no one knows what Martin Vasek, or whatever his real name was, thinks or feels, whether he is even still alive, or what meaning, if any, he assigns to the years he spent pretending to be someone else in the American heartland. What remains is the story itself, a story that began with a library clerk making a routine phone call about an overdue book, and ended with the FBI concluding that they had identified but lost a foreign intelligence officer who had operated successfully on American soil for nearly a decade. It is a story about the intersection of the mundane and the significant, about how ordinary institutional processes can sometimes reveal extraordinary hidden realities, and about the human cost of intelligence work for everyone involved, the officers who live double lives, the people who unknowingly interact with them, and the investigators who try to make sense of what happened after the fact. The biography of Leon Trotsky remains checked out to Martin Vasek at the Cedar Rapids Public Library. The house on Oakwood Drive has been rented to other tenants who know nothing of its history. Midwest Technical Documentation Services continues to operate, though under different ownership and with more rigorous security procedures. And somewhere, perhaps in the Czech Republic, perhaps somewhere else entirely, a man who once lived as Martin Vasek carries memories of 8 years in Iowa, years that were simultaneously the most successful period of his intelligence career, and perhaps the loneliest stretch of his entire life. The Cold War ended more than 3 decades ago. The ideological conflict that motivated operations like Vasek's has been replaced by different tensions and different threats. But the fundamental dynamics of intelligence work remain unchanged. Nations still spy on each other. Officers still live under cover. Operations still unfold in ordinary places among ordinary people who have no idea what is happening around them. And occasionally, someone making a routine phone call about an overdue library book sets in motion events that expose a hidden reality that has been operating just beneath the surface of everyday life. That is the legacy of the Martin Vasek case. Not drama or heroism or tragedy in the conventional sense, but rather a quiet reminder that the world is more complicated than it appears, and that sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the most mundane details. A library book, a court summons, a $50 fine, and a man who disappeared rather than let anyone discover who he really was.